Hello and welcome to Credible Faith, episode number 16, issue number 1 of Off the Books, the part of the show in which I interview authors, thinkers, leaders, or whoever else has made a positive impact through books, essays, or other forms of communication. And today I have with me Dr. Lydia McGrew, who's going to be talking about the Blaming the Losers historical explanation for cultural changes and the Noble Sacrifice historical explanation, as well as how we are to think about some of the changes that have happened and the apparent loss in the culture war in the front of the advances in the transgender and homosexual movements. It's great to have her on. Lydia, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's a beautiful day here in Kalamazoo, Michigan.
Oh, that's great. It's nice here too. Hey, before we get into this, I would like to give Lydia, if you don't know who Lydia McGrew is, she is the author of Hidden in Plain Sight, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts, and also an upcoming book, which is, Lydia?
It's going to be called The Mirror or the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices. It'll continue to defend the historicity of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the Bible.
And when will that be? Do you have an idea of when that will be coming out or no?
Yeah, I do. Right now, our intention is for that to be available for pre-order by November 20th of this year and available for order for real in December. You can follow me on Facebook to get updates on that. You don't have to be my Facebook friend. You can just follow my public content.
If this is too much to ask, you can just ignore the question. But do you have a address for how to follow you on Facebook?
Just look me up. Just look up Lydia McGrew.
Okay.
And right now, I believe my profile picture, I'm in a red dress. You should recognize me right away by the fact that my public content is mostly about the New Testament and also about cultural conservative issues.
Okay. And for people that don't know, who is Lydia McGrew? Tell us some about your background.
I am an analytic philosopher, widely published analytic philosopher. My PhD is in English, but virtually all of my publications have been in philosophy, particularly what's called formal epistemology or theory of knowledge. I am a blogger, homeschooling mother, and I'm the wife of Timothy McGrew, who's an apologist and philosopher that they may also have heard of. Now, in the last few years, more recently, I've been writing books in New Testament studies.
Okay. Hey, you mentioned blogger, but you didn't mention your blog. What is your blog? If people want to go out and read some of what you've written.
Right. So the group blog is what'swrongwiththeworld.net, but the easiest way to get to all of my content is easier to remember. Just go to lydiamcgrew.com. Just type it all in, and that's like a portal. That's going to take you to all kinds of archives of my past material. I am not putting as much material on blogs nowadays as I am on my public Facebook content because it's much quicker to just post something short and set it to public on Facebook. So that's the easiest way to follow my ongoing work.
Okay. Also, this isn't something that's very public knowledge, but something that I love about Lydia McGrew has to do with the fact that she, like myself, is a lover of hymns. So as a quick side diversion before we get into some of the material from a post that's actually on that What's Wrong with the World blog, Lydia, how did you get interested in or become a lover of hymns?
Oh, I was raised as a lover of hymns. I was raised Baptist.
Okay.
I am now Anglican. I'm not a very good Anglican, but I am an Anglican.
What does it mean to be not a very good Anglican?
Oh, well, we call ourselves High Church Baptists.
Okay.
So, for example, I don't believe in infant baptism, but Anglicans do believe in infant baptism. So that's an example of what I mean by not a very good Anglican. But I was raised fundamentalist Baptist. I'm actually rather proud of that. And went to a Baptist Bible college in Pennsylvania. So that's my background. And then I came to have a love of the liturgy, the traditional Anglican liturgy, and also a love of the Anglican hymns as well. So I like to bring those two together, Anglican hymnody and Baptist hymnody, and those hymns of the faith that I learned as a child as well.
Okay, great. All right, that said, enough of the side stuff. Let's get into some of the material on your Blaming the Losers post that you have in the What's Wrong with the World blog. Some ways into your essay, you state that, quote, "It looks like we have lost the culture wars, and the temptation to blame, quote unquote, us, or some historical version of, quote unquote, us, is for some people apparently irresistible," end quote. And your essay actually looks at one contemporary example in which someone does blame us for losing a culture war. Now, We'll get to that example in a bit, but for right now, why don't you give us what we might call the blaming the losers explanation of history? Can you tell me what that is?
Right, and I may word it in a way that's a little bit different than I worded it there, but very
Okay.
similar. Allegedly, American conservatives have lost the culture wars because pietistic American fundamentalists retreated from the world. They retreated from culture and science. They wasted their best and brightest by being anti-culture, anti-art, anti-science, and anti-elite, and this left a vacuum into which the left entered, and it left intelligent American conservatives vulnerable to proselytizing by more cultured and educated leftists. That created a tendency for groups and institutions to swing to the left. Also, when Americans entered the political realm, they did it wrong, allegedly. So American conservatives lost because they did not properly engage.
Okay. So that would be what we would call the blaming the losers narrative for how we came to the point in which it appears that conservatives lost the culture war. Now, you quite strongly disagree with that narrative, or at least would very greatly qualify it. And you have another historical narrative that you would like your readers to consider, what we might call the noble sacrifice narrative. And basically what you're doing is asking the reader to take a step back and look at the question of historical explanation more broadly and consider that other narrative or how one thinks about a loss that one experiences. It doesn't have to be in the American culture war, although that's a particular thing that we would be considering here. Tell me about your noble sacrifice, quote unquote, narrative for the explanation of history that would be an alternative to the blaming the losers one.
Sure, and it's interesting that you gave it that name, but I think that's a legitimate name. You know, we used to think of rearguard actions as noble and worth making an epic out of. This was true of ancient literal battles that have gone down in history, or people who were famous for just carrying on in the face of overwhelming defeat. So the Battle of Thermopylae, for example, the death of the 500. Or no one survives the sack of Troy but Aeneas. He leaves the burning city with nothing but his aged father on his back and his little boy holding his hand, going forth from the ashes of Troy to found Rome eventually. There's a wonderful Anglo-Saxon poem, The Battle of Maldon. The Christian Anglo-Saxons are being defeated by the heathen Vikings. One of them encourages his companions by saying, "Mind must be the firmer, heart the more fierce, courage the greater, as our strength lessens." And then they all get slaughtered by the Vikings. But it's a very inspiring poem. And it's been a motto, really, for my whole adult life. So the idea is that you may be defeated in the short run. You may even die. You may lose the immediate battle and not accomplish what you were immediately hoping to accomplish. But your legacy lives on because you didn't focus group. You didn't compromise. You stood your ground for something worth fighting about. You know, this is why people love the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Jimmy Stewart says the only causes worth fighting for are lost causes in that movie. Now, I've always found such stories inspiring. They show us that God has a perspective on our effort that does not depend on whether we achieve our immediate objective. Instead, he calls us to be faithful. As that Steve Green song says, may all who come behind us find us faithful. So my alternative in this case would be that those who went before us really were faithful, and they actually accomplished more than is being recognized in the culture wars, even if in the long run, the culture is being taken over in ways that they did hold back for a long time.
Okay, these two narratives, the blaming the losers one, the noble sacrifice one, is it an either or? Is it both and? If it's not an either or, how might they both be partially true?
Yeah, they could both be partially true, and I think they are. I have my own favorite examples of how the culture warriors of the past could have done things differently or better. One of my own sort of hobby horses, because I am an epistemologist, is that I think they should not have embraced presuppositionalism in Christian apologetics. They should have been evidentialists. So, but by and large, I mean, certain things are going to be by and large the explanation sometimes. So by and large, I think the conquest of the culture by the left has come through force majeure, that is to say, overwhelming force. Externally, there's just been this enormous push by forces with an enormous amount of culture, financial, political power to crush all opposition, indoctrinate children, enshrine excesses of the sexual revolution. In some ways, I almost think that even more withdrawal from the world, contrary to the narrative, might hold back this force better in some individual cases. So sometimes blaming the losers actually leads us to give bad advice for moving forward. Individual cases is what we need to be looking at now.
Okay. Hey, we're going to take another side trip here, and that you mentioned that you think there was a mistake to go down the presuppositionalism route rather than the evidentialism route. I don't want to turn this into a talk about presuppositionalism versus evidentialism, but if you can give like a nutshell version of your reason for thinking that, not just saying that I would agree or disagree, but some people might find it interesting. Why would be, in a nutshell version, Lydia McGrew's take on why it was a mistake to go down the presuppositionalism route over the evidentialism one?
Right. Well, presuppositionalism as a epistemic and apologetic position is just incorrect. And that is the position that if we don't start from the Bible, we're not going to end with the Bible, that that we must start from believing that the Bible is God's word and just argue from that, rather than saying, let's start with, we're not actually assuming that as a premise, and argue for, say, the reliability of the Bible from information that does not require us to assume that the Bible is true. And for example, we can use the scriptural accounts as historical documents and evaluate them in that respect, and they hold up remarkably well. And then we can defend that, because the thing is, the Mormons are presuppositionalists. The Muslims are presuppositionalists. Every cult out there can be presuppositionalist. And then how do you know which one to choose? It becomes arbitrary. So we want to not be arbitrary. We want to have strong, objective, evidential grounding.
Understood. All right. Thanks for your nutshell version. Getting back to the main road here, you state in your essay that, quote, in politics and history, the desire to blame the losers strongly is for some people almost irresistible, end quote. And you say that you find this tendency puzzling. And later on, you do give an example of this type of thing from today's day and age. But before we get to that, what do you think are some of the reasons that the tendency to blame the losers in politics and history is so strong?
I think people are very uncomfortable with tragedy, Paul. I think it makes people feel afraid and helpless. It's odd to me, because I feel inspired by identifying with the noble losing side, but that's not what most people are. Most people feel that it's frightening to say my side did their best and we didn't get in the long run what we were aiming at. It's easier to blame the losers because it makes you feel like you can do better. And it grants this sense of psychological distance. It's a little bit like when a friend gets cancer and you say, oh yeah, that's because he was out there tanning all the time. Well, I won't do that. And that makes it a lot easier because you think you can avoid that. It's also much easier if you're sort of saying that the losers are us, but they're not us. They were conservatives, but they were not my kind of conservatives, or they lived a long time ago or something. Blaming your ideological ancestors brings a feeling of psychological safety, but at the same time, you're sort of saying you identify with them, but not so much that you're going to share in their loss. So it doesn't really amount to criticizing yourself. I think also blaming the losers arises from the human desire to understand. Human beings are insatiably curious, and we're always looking for some grand narrative. We want to know the causes of things. And to say that the biggest cause was just that the other guys held all the cards of power, and we couldn't have gotten better cards if we had played better, that seems intellectually unsatisfying, I think, a lot of times to people.
Okay. You mentioned the idea of psychological distance, and one of the things that came to my mind was, from what you said, the idea of control, that if there's some other reason that explains why we lost, then if only we change that, then we can make the outcome different. Whereas if you're losing by just sheer lack of force, then you're not going to win, because it's just a numbers game in a sense in that respect. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And I think people don't like to shift to the individual case. It's amazing how much waste God allows in his narrative of history. So, God will use a giant machine to crush a single nut. He will do all kinds of roundabout things, and the whole point from his perspective might be to save one soul. And I think we human beings have a lot of trouble facing that. We want to bring in numbers. We want to turn the whole culture around. We want to win at a larger level. Now, I'm not saying that would be a bad thing, because then that would result in souls saved. But I don't think you can add and subtract souls. I could put my whole life's effort in, and there could be one person I would meet in heaven who would say, I'm here because of you. And that could make my whole life worthwhile. It's this old saying, Jesus would have died if you were the only person in the world.
Amen.
And so I think it's very hard for us to get that godlike perspective.
Yeah. Thank you. You give two quotes in your post, and I'm going to read much of those quotes. Here's one of the quotes. This is from a contemporary example from a guy named Michael Horton, and he wrote a post in which he takes sort of a blaming the losers perspective. So I'm going to read two of the quotes that you have, and then we'll go from there. This is Michael Horton. The Gnostic's hatred of the world can take two forms. Either the Gnostic insists on destroying it and remaking it all over again in the form of pure spirit, or he recoils from the world altogether and seeks security in a small group of purists who isolate themselves from the godless. We can see both approaches in countless movements that are always deeply religious or spiritual in their basic motive. Even when the proletariat replaces God, raise this world to its foundations, and build a new civilization from scratch, history is moving toward an endpoint, either of apocalyptic disaster or utopia, and we are going to be agents of this providential destiny. So that's the first quote. The second quote is, we also see the two approaches of the Gnostic in various forms of evangelical engagement with politics. For the first half of the 20th century, fundamentalists tended to separate themselves from the godless world, but then became politically engaged in the 1980s. Their basic attitude to the world, however, remained constant, a relatively hostile view of culture, science, the arts, and especially of, quote-unquote, elites, who increasingly were themselves Gnostics of the left. The same Manichaean divide between light and darkness, the saints and the reprobate, agents of revolutionary freedom versus co-conspirators with the forces of evil. Now, you think, quote, this analysis of American evangelicalism in the 20th century, end quote, is full of holes. You give a number of examples about why you think this is wrong. But first, give us a sort of high-level overview of why you think that perspective is wrong and what you think really happened.
Right. Well, first of all, it's way over-intellectualized. It sounds, kind of highbrow to say that American evangelicals were fundamentalists were Gnostics, but that doesn't really add anything to just saying, for example, they were too strict. So, example, if you had a rule against dancing or something, you can say, well, that was too strict. But to call it Gnostic adds nothing to our understanding. It just makes you sound like you're intellectual. Okay. But it's also not necessary for the evangelicals themselves or the fundamentalists themselves to be highbrow in order to love the world. So, for example, it doesn't necessarily amount to Gnostic rejection of the world, even to have overly strict rules, because there's still going to be a love of marriage, a love of children, a love of beauty and food and so forth. There's all kinds of sort of robust love of this world that God has created in that culture, even if they're setting overly strict rules. And when we compare, the innocence of kids raised in quite a strict background in the past to kids being taught now to hate their own bodies by the left, or think that, I'm really a boy or something and take hormones, to say that the former group were Gnostics is just a kind of a sad joke. I think, too, there's a real failure to recognize what a big achievement it was to hold off the Cultural Revolution for as many decades as the American right has done. Christians in post-Christian Europe today would love to have what we have here. If you talk to somebody in Germany or the Netherlands, we built this up. We don't realize to what extent we are living on the capital of the past in the freedom that we currently enjoy. And so they did these things. So, for example, they held off the Equal Rights Amendment for a long time. And so then in these places that have been preserved, these institutions and so forth that they set up, and they made a space of freedom for those institutions to exist, greater cultural knowledge can come in there. Knowledge of art, literature, apologetics, like what I've gained in my life, into people that have not already been corrupted and indoctrinated. The other thing that's wrong about that is that, frankly, it's a failure to recognize that there really is evil in the world. I mean, it wasn't a Gnostic. It was the Apostle John who said, all that is in the world, the love of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of God. So that wasn't a Gnostic view. In fact, John was against the Gnostics. So there is real evil. It's not Gnostic. Yeah. It's just realism. And we need to oppose that evil because we love the world that God has made. So I think it's a very unnuanced view because it's trying too hard to fit things into this Procrustean bed that I think probably comes from Eric Voegelin, would be my guess, where you call everybody you don't like a Gnostic.
Okay. You referred to the limit on dancing. And when you look at the issue of rules, it's not so much whether or not rules on dancing goes too far, but in some cases, rules that are put in place because one recognizes that those can lead to harm to something that is good and pure. Like, for example, the preservation of sexual purity is a good thing, and rules that some people put in place, the aim and the intention of some of those rules is to protect that good thing. So you're loving the world, the good thing that is there, by putting in the rules. So it's not a rejection of the world as much as it is wanting to preserve what is good in the world.
Yes, and then we just decide what's the most prudent way to do that.